Okay, so you're here because, let's be honest, the development approval process in the NSW, it can feel like a bit of a black box, right? You want to understand it, but you don't necessarily want to spend weeks reading through all the legislation and guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you also know that getting it right is like absolutely crucial if you want your project to actually succeed.
Right.
And in our research for this deep dive, we kept coming back to one key player, the architect.
Yeah, they're so central to this whole process.
Right, so we've got a bunch of sources here, legislation guidelines, real-world case studies, and what we want to do today is unpack the architect's role at every stage.
Exactly, because it's way more than just designing a pretty building.
Way more.
It's about navigating this really complex system, making sure everything is compliant, and advocating for the project every step of the way.
So let's start right at the very beginning with the pre-development stage.
Okay.
And our sources really highlight two key aspects here: preliminary planning and those initial consultations with the council or state agencies.
Right.
Now, when we talk about preliminary planning, what immediately jumps out is the sheer depth of analysis that the architect undertakes.
Yeah, that's really impressive.
It's not just about sketching up ideas, it's about understanding the site inside and out.
Exactly.
And the sources emphasize this site analysis and feasibility study as being like the foundation of the entire project.
Yeah, because it's about figuring out what's even possible on that piece of land.
Right, like what are the constraints, what are the opportunities, and how do we make sure that whatever we're envisioning is actually achievable?
Right, and that includes looking at things like zoning regulations, what the land can legally be used for,
Right.
environmental factors like the slope of the land, the amount of sunlight it gets, potential bushfire risks, all sorts of stuff.
It's almost like they're playing detective.
In a way, yeah, they're piecing together all this information to build a really comprehensive picture of the site.
And for you, the listener, this is where you really start to see the value of having an expert on your team.
Absolutely, because they can spot potential issues early on, things that you might not even think about.
Right, like maybe the zoning doesn't allow for the type of development you had in mind, or there are some environmental constraints that would make construction really difficult.
Exactly.
And by identifying these things early on, the architect can save you a lot of time and money down the track.
Yeah, it's about preventing those nasty surprises later on.
Right, so once the architect has a really solid understanding of the site, then it's time to move on to concept design and visioning.
Okay.
And this is where the project really starts to take shape visually, but it's not just about aesthetics, is it?
No, not at all. It's very much a collaborative process. The architect is working closely with you, the developer, any other stakeholders to translate your objectives into a tangible vision.
So it's about taking those abstract ideas and turning them into something concrete.
Exactly. And it's a real balancing act because they also have to consider all those constraints we talked about earlier, the zoning, the environmental factors, the budget, all of that.
Right, so they're kind of like the bridge between your vision and the reality of what's possible.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And one thing that really stood out in the sources is the emphasis on early stakeholder engagement,
Yeah, that's so important.
particularly with local councils.
Right.
So why is that so crucial?
Well, by bringing the council in early on and presenting those initial concepts and having those open discussions about potential challenges and opportunities,
Yeah.
it allows the architects to kind of get a feel for the council's perspective
Right.
and potentially identify any major roadblocks early on.
So it's about building those relationships and understanding those perspectives from the get-go.
Exactly. And that can save a lot of headaches down the line.
Right, because if you wait until the very end to engage with the council and they come back with a whole bunch of issues, well, then you're back to the drawing board potentially.
Exactly. It's much better to address those things up front.
And speaking of the council, that brings us to the next key stage, the formal application process. And the big one here is the development application, or DA.
Right.
Now, the architect's role in preparing this DA is incredibly detailed.
It's a huge undertaking.
And one of the key documents they produce is the site plan.
Right.
So what exactly is a site plan and why is it so important?
Well, the site plan is essentially a map that shows exactly where the proposed development will be located on the land.
Okay.
It includes things like the boundaries of the property, the location of any existing structures, proposed new buildings, driveways, landscaping, all of that.
So it's like a bird's eye view of the entire project.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And the level of detail required here is quite extraordinary, right?
It needs to be very accurate and very precise.
Because this is the document that the council's going to use to assess the visual impact of the development.
Exactly. They need to be able to clearly see how the proposed building will fit into the surrounding environment.
Right, and how it will affect things like views, sunlight access, privacy, all of that. And
Exact.
alongside the site plan, the architect also produces another crucial set of drawings, the architectural drawings.
Right.
And these are the ones that really show us what the building itself will look like.
Yeah, they provide a much more detailed picture of the design.
So we're talking floor plans, elevation sections, all of that.
Exact.
And again, the level of detail here is incredible
It has to be.
because these drawings need to convey every aspect of the design, from the layout of the rooms to the materials used to the finishes.
Right, they're essentially the blueprints for the entire building.
And this is where the architect's creativity and technical expertise really shine through.
Absolutely. They're not only designing a building that meets your needs, but they're also making sure that it's structurally sound and that it complies with all the relevant building codes.
And increasingly these days, sustainability is a major consideration in any development project.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more important.
And the architect plays a key role in incorporating sustainable design features into the project.
Okay,
So what are some example of sustainable design features that we might see in a DA?
well, there's a whole range of things that can be done.
Yeah.
Some common examples include using energy-efficient building materials like double-glazed windows or mistillation,
Right.
incorporating solar panels or rainwater harvesting systems into the design,
Okay.
and even thinking about the orientation of the building to maximize natural light and ventilation.
This is about reducing the environmental impact of the building throughout its entire life cycle.
Exactly, from construction all the way through to operation.
And these sustainable design features are not just a nice to have, they're often mandated by the council through things like the basic assessment.
Right.
So the architect needs to be very familiar with those requirements and make sure that the design meets those standards.
Absolutely.
Now, another important document that the architect contributes to is the Statement of Environmental Effects, or EAA.
Okay.
And this is where we really start to see the architect's role in assessing the broader impact of the development.
Yeah, it's about looking beyond the building itself and considering how it will affect the surrounding environment and the community.
So the SAD outlines potential issues like increased traffic or noise pollution or impact on local flora and fauna,
Right.
and it also proposes mitigation strategies to address those concerns.
Exactly. It's about demonstrating that the development has been carefully considered and that steps are being taken to minimize any negative impacts.
And this is where the architect's expertise in environmental design really comes to the fore.
Absolutely. They have a deep understanding of how buildings interact with the environment,
Right.
and they can use that knowledge to come up with innovative solutions to minimize the impact.
So it's not just about complying with regulations, it's about going above and beyond to create a truly sustainable development.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Now, throughout this whole DA process, the architect is constantly navigating a very complex web of regulations.
Right.
And two of the key documents here are the Local Environmental Plan, or LEP, and the Development Control Plan, or DCP.
Okay.
Can you explain what these documents are and why they're so important for the architect to understand?
Sure. So the LAP is essentially the overarching planning document for a particular local government area.
Right.
It sets out the broad vision for how that area should develop, and it includes things like zoning maps, which determine what types of development are allowed in different areas.
Okay.
And it also sets out objectives and controls for things like environmental protection, heritage conservation, and infrastructure provision.
So it's kind of like the rule book for development in that area.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And then the DCP provides more detailed guidelines on how development should occur within that framework.
Right.
So it covers things like building height setbacks from property boundaries, landscaping requirements, car parking provision, all of that. So it's about ensuring that development is consistent and that it meets the specific needs of that area.
Exactly.
And the architect needs to be intimately familiar with both the AIP and the DCP because these documents dictate what they can and can't do with the design.
Absolutely.
They need to make sure that the proposed development complies with all the relevant regulations, otherwise the DA is likely to be refused.
Right.
And it's not just about understanding the letter of the law, it's also about understanding the intent behind those regulations.
Yeah, because sometimes there's some room for interpretation,
Right?
and a good architect will be able to use their knowledge and experience to present the best possible case for their design.
So they're not just following the rules blindly. They're using their expertise to navigate those rules and achieve the best possible outcome for the client.
Exactly.
And it's not just the FAP and the DCP that the architect needs to be aware of.
Right.
There are often other specialist reports that need to be prepared as part of the DA.
Yeah, depending on the nature of the project.
So this might include things like a heritage assessment, if the site has historical significance,
Okay.
or a traffic impact study to assess the impact of the development on local roads,
Right.
or an acoustic report to make sure that the building won't generate excessive noise.
Yeah, all sorts of things.
And the architect is often the one who coordinates all of these specialist reports.
They're kind of like the conductor of the orchestra, making sure that everyone is playing in tune.
Right, they're bringing together all these different experts and ensuring that their input is incorporated into the overall DA.
Exactly.
So it's a very multifaceted role,
It
and it
is.
requires a lot of coordination and communication.
Absolutely.
Now, once the DA has been lodged, it enters the assessment phase,
Okay.
and this is where the council takes a really close look at the application and decides whether or not to approve it.
Right.
And during this process, the architect often acts as the main point of contact between the client and the council.
Yeah, they're kind of like the intermediary.
Right, so if the council has any questions or concerns about the application, they'll typically go to the architects first,
Exactly.
and the architect will then work with the client to address those concerns.
Right.
And this might involve providing further information or making minor changes to the design.
Yeah, it's all about trying to get the application over the line.
Now, sometimes the DA will be publicly notified,
Okay.
which means that members of the public can submit their feedback on the proposal.
Right.
And if there are any concerns raised, the architect might be involved in addressing those concerns.
Yeah, they might attend community meetings or write letters to the council explaining the rationale behind the design.
And it's important to remember that the architect is not just advocating for the client. They're also advocating for good design.
Absolutely.
So they'll be trying to find solutions that meet the needs of both the client and the community.
Right.
And they'll also be drawing on their knowledge of best practice design principles to ensure that the development is of a high quality.
Exactly.
Now, if the council is satisfied with the application, they'll issue a notice of determination granting development consent.
Okay.
But even then, the architect's work isn't quite finished,
Right.
because the development consent will typically come with a whole bunch of conditions.
Yeah, those are the specific requirements that the developer must meet in order to proceed with the project.
And the architect plays a key role in reviewing those conditions and making sure that they're clear and achievable.
Exactly. They need to make sure that the conditions don't create any unforeseen problems or conflicts with the design.
And if there are any issues, the architect will work with the council to try and resolve them.
Right.
So it's an ongoing process of negotiation and collaboration.
Yeah, it's all about finding the best possible outcome for everyone involved.
Now, in some cases, the council might refuse the DA.
Okay.
And if that happens, the architect can help the client to understand the reasons for the refusal
Right.
and advise them on their options.
Yeah, so those options might include lodging an appeal with the Land and Environment Court,
Okay?
or revising the design and resubmitting the DA,
Right.
or even abandoning the project altogether.
And the architect can also provide support and guidance throughout that appeal process if that's the route that the client chooses to take.
Absolutely. They can prepare expert reports or even give evidence in court.
So even in a situation where the DA is refused, the architect still has a valuable role to play.
Yeah, they're there to support the client through that difficult process.
And sometimes even after the DA has been approved, there might be a need to modify the consent.
Okay.
So this could be because the client's circumstances have changed or because there have been unforeseen issues during the construction process.
Right.
And the architect can assist with preparing and submitting a modification application to the council.
Yeah, they're familiar with the process, and they can help to ensure that the application is well prepared and has the best chance of success.
So once again, we see the architect's role extending beyond the initial design phase.
Yeah, they're involved throughout the entire life cycle of the project.
Right, from the initial feasibility study all the way through to construction and beyond.
Exactly.
Now, once the DA has been approved and any necessary modifications have been made, the next step is to obtain a construction certificate, or CC. And this is where the architect's focus shifts from the conceptual design to the detailed documentation required for construction.
Right.
So they'll be preparing detailed drawings and specifications that outline exactly how the building should be constructed.
Yeah, these drawings and specifications cover everything from the foundations to the roof.
Right.
And they need to be very precise because they're the documents that the builder will use to construct the building.
And the architect also needs to make sure that the design complies with all the relevant building codes and Australian standards.
Absolutely. That's crucial.
Because the CC certifier will be checking the documentation very carefully to make sure that everything is up to scratch.
Right.
And if there are any discrepancies, the architect will need to resolve those before the CC can be issued.
Yeah, so it's a very detailed and meticulous process.
It is.
But it's essential to ensure that the building is safe and structurally sound.
And the architect is also responsible for specifying the materials and finishes to be used in the construction.
Right.
And they'll often work closely with the client to select those materials and finishes.
Yeah, to make sure that they meet the client's budget and aesthetic preferences.
Now, in some cases, it might be possible to obtain a complying development certificate, or CDC, instead of a CC.
Okay.
And this is a faster and simpler approval pathway for certain types of straightforward development.
Right.
But the design still needs to meet very specific criteria in order to be eligible for a CDC.
Exactly.
And the architect can help to assess whether a CDC is a viable option for a particular project.
Yeah, they can also make sure that the design complies with all the relevant CDC requirements.
Now, once construction is underway, the architect will typically conduct site inspections to monitor progress and make sure that the building is being constructed according to the approved plans.
Right.
And they'll also be available to answer any questions that the builder might have about the design.
Yeah, it's about providing ongoing support and guidance throughout the construction process.
And once construction is complete, the architects will conduct a final inspection to make sure that the building is compliant with the approved plans and that it's ready for occupation.
Right.
And they'll then issue a certificate of practical completion to the client,
Okay.
which signifies that the building work is finished and that the client can move in.
Right.
So as you can see, the architect's role in the development approval process is incredibly comprehensive.
It is.
They're involved at every stage from the initial feasibility study all the way through to the final handover of the completed building.
Exactly.
And they play a vital role in ensuring that the development is not only aesthetically pleasing, but also functional, sustainable, and compliant with all the relevant regulations.
Yeah, they're really the glue that holds the whole process together.
And for you, the listener, this deep dive has hopefully given you a much better understanding of the complexity of the development approval process
Right.
and the importance of having a skilled and experienced architect on your team.
Absolutely, they can make all the difference.
So if you're thinking about embarking on a development project in NSW, make sure you engage an architect early on.
Yeah, it's the best way to set yourself up for success.
And to ensure that your project meets all the necessary requirements and achieves its full potential.
Right.
Now, this deep dive has really just scratched the surface of the development approval process.
Yeah, there's so much more to learn.
And I'm sure you've got a whole bunch of questions swimming around in your head now.
Probably.
Like, what happens if there's a dispute with the council? Or how do you navigate the Land and Environment Court if your DA is refused?
Right.
Well, those are all great questions, and I encourage you to do your own research and find out more about those specific aspects of the process.
Yeah, there are some great resources available online and through industry bodies.
And remember, every project is unique, so what works for one development might not work for another.
Absolutely.
But by understanding the basics of the process and by working closely with a qualified architect, you can significantly increase your chances of success. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world of development.
Sounds good.